Folks, my name is Colin Lee, and I run the Twin Cities Kotlin users group in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I have with me here Josh Shin, and I think soon we have, here it is, Kevin Galligan joining us. Hey, Kevin.
Hi.
Hey, Josh.
Hello.
Hello. We're going to have a dog show and tell briefly.
I can have a lot of those. There we are.
There he is.
Cute.
Yeah, well, yeah, sometimes. Right, buddy? No, he's cool. It's 6 a.m.
Mostly.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Bye. The dog doesn't know what to do. He usually doesn't stay up here, though. He likes to go. Cool. Unless I have food. If I'm eating, he'll stay here.
So let's do some quick sort of like intros. First off, so this is we're doing this on Restream, so people are going to see this on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. If you're watching this right now, you can type in the chat, and we see everything you type, and we can respond and actually answer questions that way. So this is interactive, guys. Kevin, why don't you start? Why don't you tell us your background, some things you've done with Kotlin?
It's funny. I was thinking that this was like the backstage and everyone's watching right now. Okay, about myself. I started this company, Touchlab. It was an Android-only shop years ago, say 2010, 2011. And then I started the Kotlin Meetup in New York in 2014, and absolutely nobody cared. In 2014, that is for sure. Yeah, I don't know. I was poking around with it on and off for years, and then, started getting serious. And then sort of when KMP started up, got really heavily into that quite early, before the IDEs even really worked. One might argue. So since then, for a bit of open source stuff and doing, especially in the last year or two, a lot of production. KMM, which is kind of why we're here, right?
Nice. Cool. So, so Kevin, Josh, why don't you tell people about some stuff you've done?
Yeah, so I'm started Android development like 5 years ago. And then a year ago, started doing iOS development and over at Volley, and we been doing KMM for about, I want to say like 7 months. I think we've been in production for 3 months now, and it's been really exciting. I love it so far.
Okay, nice. My name is Colin Lee. I'll just do the intro for me. I obviously run the Meetup, but also I work at a place called Meetup. I work on the Android apps there and mobile apps, but lately we've been dipping our feet into KMM as well. And I actually have background from years ago trying multi-platform projects before there was something called KMM in Kotlin, and I'm doing it for conference talks. So I think that'd be a good topic to start off with. Like a lot of us saw Kotlin multi-platform years ago, and like there was the first Kotlin Conf, they actually showed us an iOS demo using Kotlin. But what has KMM changed? Like how has it progressed since then? What is new in the world of KMM?
Since you mean the 2017 Kotlin Conf when they were showing us? So we're heavily involved in DroidCon, or at least we were in North America. And we tried to have the first Kotlin native app store. And they beat us for that conference with 2 weeks to spare. But at the time it wasn't really multi-platform, it was like native. And it wasn't really shared code, it was like you're coding your screens in Kotlin. And there was a bunch of hacks, and it was crazy. And they were kind of pitching it then, and I was like, it's a little early. It's kind of like, I feel like it's a constant struggle between the marketing side of any software business and then the actual tech people. And if you like went to the talk or at least the keynote, it was like, oh, this is almost ready to try out. And it was like, absolutely not remotely close to ready to try out, like beyond not ready to try out. And KMM as a designation didn't exist until like a year ago, not even really. It's like I kind of call it a marketing designation for native mobile inside of KMP, although it's a little more complicated than that. But everything's dramatically changed. The capability to use the IDE and the configuration, like we've gone through, I think, 3 completely distinct Gradle configurations for native and KMP, KMM. And I would say the library ecosystem stability, everything. It's really kind of come a long way. The follow-up question, is it ready for production? It's not really a binary question. We could probably spend the rest of the time here talking about that question.
Probably will dip into that a bit, yeah.
Yeah, I remember that conference, and when I first heard about Kotlin Native and being really skeptical, just like going like, I'm like, okay, all right, guys. But yeah, within the last couple of years, there's just a proliferation of talks of people beginning to use it, experimenting, and that's what really piqued my interest. And then when we first started playing around with it at Volley, the only like just knowing where to start was really tough. That's where like CamKit from Touchlab was instrumental for us, because this is before like it had IDE integration, and like now it's come so far that you could like start a new project like KMM project, and it's much friendlier. Like there are still, I think, hiccups like but it's just much easier to get started, I think, now. And then like back like a year ago, just like there were things like suspend functions not translating to Swift very well, and now that's taken care of. So I think it's really come a long way.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited, by like using a lot of this new stuff. But if there's a lot of developers who they see something that says it's cross-platform or multi-platform, they think of React Native, they think of Xamarin projects they've worked on. They look at every attempt to make something cross-platform that has resulted in somehow as much work or more work even in some cases, because people have very exacting requirements. How did it go for you guys? You both did professional projects with KMM or Kotlin Multiplatform, and how did it transition? What were the range of responses beforehand from developers, and what were they like afterwards?
I feel like it's different. Like inside of the specific org, it's probably like the Volley story is probably gonna be like interesting in a very specific way. Like ours, like. So here's my actual day-to-day job, at least going back the last few years, right? Like I kind of, we're a consulting company, but I've largely worked myself out of doing business. Like it's like the developer dream job where you have just enough revenue that I could work full-time on like R&D and do weird things. So before KMP, I was doing a whole ecosystem around J2OBJC, which everyone thought I was crazy and nobody wanted to hear about. And that never changed. Like I never convinced anybody that this was a good idea, to the point where I had like Room running on iPhone like a couple days after they released it, like a day and a half. Like it's how stable and functional this stuff was. But nobody cared. But I really was like, if you can remove the barriers to not duplicating logic, forget UI, forget everything else, but just like, if you can improve the situation some, that has to make sense. And I was describing to someone recently, like I got really into KMP, like to the point where 2018, I posted a blog post thinking like, because the Cash App team, Alec and Jake did SQL Delight, and they made it KMP ready. Like it was no native implementation, but it was like there could be one. And I did like basically a stunt. I took the driver from the J2OBJC thing I did and put SQLite on top of that. But it was crazy. Like the interest level was night and day compared to everything. I was like, oh, it was amazing. But like at the time, absolutely nobody was using it in any way, shape, or form. And I gave a talk at an iOS meetup like probably less than a year later, and to say skeptical was like the response was not. They were polite, but like let's say not into it.
Mm-hmm.
So we were so far early. It was like if you're a fisherman and you have a boat in the middle of nowhere, and you're like, I know that there's going to be fish here eventually. And then it's like, but nobody is there with you. You start to think if you're crazy or not. But that's changing. Now people are kind of showing up. Like all of a sudden they're like, oh wait, this is neat. But every org is kind of weird because it's like, there is the battle of how do you convince people to try this out? And like, obviously a Kotlin focused thing is gonna be more appealing to Android developers, like on average, unavoidably. Like that's an understatement, right? It's like we try to, even in the Android community, like yes, the cross-platform thing, like there's like sort of a marketing war that we have to fight too, which is like I never say cross-platform unless I'm doing it almost ironically, just because that phrase is ruined. You can't say it and not have it imply a whole bunch of things that nobody wants. So we call it shared native code and not cross-platform, like that kind of stuff. It's all silly, word games, but they matter, because you have to reframe the discussion. Otherwise, it's going to be like, yeah, I tried with Cordova or PhoneGap and that didn't work. So everything else, therefore, must not work. It's not, you have to get out of that discussion.
Yeah. What about you, Josh?
Yeah, so for us, it was, to give the backstory around it, when I joined Volley, I inherited the Android code base and the iOS code base, and they had completely different architectures. And so just context switching from one to the other was very costly because it would, after working on Android, I'd switch to iOS and go like, oh, wait, how does this work again? Like what? Like I need like an afternoon to to rev up. And then also just it became annoying how much copying and pasting I was doing. Like I'd write a view model in Android, basically repeat it on iOS, like just copy and paste and convert it to Switch. And so like going to KMP was like, that was always the goal for us. Like I was very aggressive about it. The vice president at Volley was very aggressive about it. So it was like we had good buy-in there. And it was just a way, like one of the big benefits for us was the way that it helped us align the architectures as well. So it's much easier to reason about like what we're doing, what we're adding, like adding new features. It's not going like, oh, how's this work on Android? How's this work on iOS? It was like they've already got the shared interfaces, so it's easier to do that. And then, yeah, I kind of forgot the original question. So,
Well, I was asking about
I apologize. I feel like I just rambled forever too. So I think I derailed the thought process.
I was asking about the range of responses from the developers. How did they change from the beginning to the end of the project?
Oh yeah, because there was the initial concerns of how much time this would save, like, and in theory and in practice. And in practice, because it's a new technology, there were also pitfalls along with that. And the belief is that even though there are pitfalls, in the long run, we're going to save time. And then just getting people on board, like, because it was like I was a single developer working on the Volley FM app. It was easy for us because it was like just me like jumping in and out of the code. But then getting for another app that we're working on in KMP, it's like it's in iOS engineer and myself, and it's interesting because like there is hesitancy there. There's apprehension because it's like jumping into KMP. Like if something goes wrong, like they don't necessarily know how to deal with it. But like some important things were also just figuring out how to keep things comfortable for them. Like okay, this is the shared code, but like you can still write Swift like to throw into the shared module. Like we use dependency injection and like interfaces so that we can just inject Swift code into the shared module. And that put our developer at ease, because looking at Kotlin native isn't the friendliest experience, especially starting out.
I would say it's actually an interesting point. Like, if you're, having the debate, right? Like if, like in Volley's case, like I know the story well. We talked, right? It's like it wasn't a debate; it was going to happen, and then it's just a matter of like making everybody okay with it. But that's not the case everywhere, right? Like I was just thinking about this, even with our team. I would say we're all KMP at least fluent. We have some folks who are much more iOS focused than Android focused. But even in that context, like I've been on this project sort of advising, but like I started doing the initial architecture and stuff with it. And it's, you have to be prepared to like, it's almost like keep an eye on it, because it was like the architecture was very shared. And then I went back to look at it like a few weeks later, and like the iOS focused dev kind of drifted a lot of stuff into iOS land, and the Android dev was, he's like, wow, I'm gonna do this, and all of a sudden it's like the shared part of it's kind of bleeding out, and you have to be like, all right, listen, like you totally should probably do this, like put this back in there, like that kind of thing. But also, especially in the debate, be prepared with people who are knowledgeable with support to fix problems, because the problem comes up. If you're not into the shared code thing or anything new and mysterious, like even if it's not the issue, it's going to be the issue until you prove that it isn't. So you gotta like fix your build, make sure it doesn't cause problem. Like I just went, like right now, I'm trying to rebuild one of our first big apps, public one, Droidcon. We were making the Droidcon app for a few years, and it's been kind of on the shelf for a while for obvious reasons. There haven't been a lot of conferences, but I tried to drag it out and build it, and like, CocoaPod's completely not working. None of it's working. I have no idea what's going on. And that's me, right? Like if you're an Android focused dev who's trying to sell your team on KMP and you don't have like my level of experience and you run into a problem, like forget it. Like people are just gonna freak out. So you need to be prepared for that kind of stuff too. And yes, to make people feel comfortable. Passing in Swift is a really good example, because it just gives you another way to do something native and step around problems or whatever and make them feel more comfortable.
That's I think that's an interesting point you brought up too, because I definitely had an oh crap moment during development, where we got to the point where we were integrating error reporting, and realizing that the error logs for anything that threw an error in from the Kotlin code just came up as gobbledygook in the logs, like because it was like in error like
is that the technical term for it? The gobbledygook? No.
That is I believe so. From my training, yes. But yeah, because if an error starts from the Kotlin code and bubbles up, like it Kevin can explain this, but it like just makes it to the Kotlin interface as like Kotlin Objective C whatever. And that freaked me out at first. I was like, oh no. And there was I'm just gonna like plug more Touchlab libraries, but there's Crash KIOS, which helps solve the problem. But for a couple days, I was a little shook.
Oh yeah, I bet.
I mean, I've had those. you get those existential moments where you're like, oh, is this like a huge problem that is going to prevent this from being practical? Like I've had that, you know, starting very early on. It was like the stages of grief that everyone goes through with the concurrency model, where like you start with like, I don't understand this, and then you start to learn about it, and then you're angry, and then you try to get around it, and do kooky things, and you wind up losing weeks of your life trying to work around the concurrency model, and then you give in, and then you watch my ridiculous conference talk where I try to explain it. But
are we perhaps hinting at freezing of objects? Perhaps,
which will be, there is a preview of the new memory model apparently in Kotlin 1.5.3, and it's on my ever expanding list of things I'd like to try out that I never get to, hopefully soon. But yeah, there's that. There was like the existential crisis of binary size that you know, I ran into, and then turned out to have a much deeper understanding of it. So it's not a problem, but there are best practices that you can take to make it significantly less of a problem. Things like that. But yeah, like we got an email from, I can't say who. They're not a client, but they're a recognizable name, and they were like, "Hey, we tried SQL Delight in this test thing, and it added like 15 megs to our binary, and it's like a, you know, many millions of people consumer app." And they're like, "There's no way we could do that." You know, that triggered a few days of existential dread. But then I figured out what was going on. It doesn't have to be like that, but that's a whole different topic.
And there's a whole bunch of new libraries that are now starting to really adopt KMM. Not only is there SQL Delight and Ktor, but we've got now Apollo. He's really taken it on majorly in the new version that's coming out. Have you guys been starting to integrate these new libraries, and how has it been going with the being able to like write the code actually once versus expecting actual versions?
You go first, Josh. I've been going first all the time.
So yeah, we've been using Ktor, and then we've been using this is one more Touchlab plug, but the settings library from Russell Wolf, which has been great. And then haven't really touched too many of the new libraries. Like I wanna, like for some of them, I wanna see how they shake out a little bit first, because when we tried implementing our like our own open source library for caching, and just in the early days, like there was an issue where we didn't update the serialization library, and it was very difficult to debug on the iOS side because of like transitive dependencies, like just like not knowing where exactly it went wrong. So like right now we're just trying to avoid those kinds of problems.
Gotcha.
We generally maintain a set of libraries that we kind of use as the common ones. SQL Delight is weird. We're a professional deal with the cache team, and I maintain the driver mostly for SQL Delight. So to say that we use it is true, but so it doesn't really encompass the use part of it. Although it's been amazing actually recently. I forget his full name. I really apologize. But there's somebody from the community that's been not just running performance benchmarks and complaining, but running performance benchmarks, complaining, and then submitting PRs. And
nice.
like, you know, the performance increases and improvements to SQL Delight driver have been really great. Like it's stuff that we talked about, but it's like, you know, we're really going to do this now. And then somebody was like, yes, you're really going to do this now because we need it. And we're like, okay. So it's been pretty cool. Like it's professionalizing, let's put it that way. Like a lot of the stuff was, you know, probably used by 3 random people, and I knew all of them. And so we could just hop on Slack and chat. And then suddenly we're getting PRs from people I've never met that are like aggressive, but really good PRs. That's crazy. We don't really use GraphQL for anything right now in client apps, but I'd love to try out Apollo and see how their implementation is going. Realm, I have a really interesting background with Realm because I've been doing sort of database stuff forever, and It's a long story, but anyway, I'm really excited that they have a preview at least, or sort of an alpha version of their multi-platform realm implementation, which should be pretty interesting. So I think what's going to be really big for the next 6-ish months is when compiler plugin support improves, KSP for multi-platform sort of formalizes. Because what's missing is Kotlin native. It's very similar to Swift in the same way that Java is actually very similar to Objective-C, in that Java and Objective-C have reflection and all kinds of dynamic programming stuff you can do. Kotlin native and Swift absolutely do not. Like, you cannot do reflection beyond what's available in the source. Like, it's not at runtime. You can't do any of that stuff. So there's a big hole of functionality missing for libraries without, like, you can write compiler plugins, but it is like no documentation. Like, you got to go figure out every step of the way. It's a real slow slog. So once that becomes something that is commonly known in the library developer community, I think it's going to really it's going to add a lot of stuff that's kind of missing.
Yeah.
So pretty excited.
Yeah, we're excited too. We're actually trying to write our own libraries that are going to use Kotlin Multiplatform as well, so that we can reuse stuff. Internally.
Really? Oh, internal library stuff.
Internal. Well, okay, maybe down the road we'll do open source. I'm sure we will.
Well, I would say that we could have a whole nother thing about, like, internally. We're trying to have a professional. I keep saying professionalized. Such an adult. I should wear a button down or something. But no, we started doing open source, and I feel like everyone kind of starts. We talked to a lot of orgs who were like, "Oh, we want to open source that." And my first question now, as I'm learning the economics of it, it's like, why do you want to open source that? Do you have a goal? Like, is it just because it's nice to say? Like, you got to figure out why you want to do it. So I don't think automatically you should just open source stuff, right? Because then you got to own it, and maybe it's not very good. But I would say there's a surprisingly large trend of orgs internally attempting to do shared SDK library stuff like for their internal org with KMM and KMP, which is it's got sort of, and a lot of things that we're focused on are like, all the examples are sort of tutorial level necessarily, because we're at that phase, right? And a lot of the real big production stuff, the scaling stuff, is all like bespoke, behind closed doors kind of thing, which is true even in Android world, but there's still a lot of that knowledge that's come out during conference talks and all that kind of stuff in the last decade, but that's not out really yet for KMP. So orgs trying to do internal SDKs, it can be difficult. There's a lot of problems everyone's resolving, which we're internally trying to like slowly solve them once and maybe push them out a bit. But it's cool to hear. I'd be very interested to hear how that goes.
I'll find out soon. Let's take. I got a question here. It looks like an interesting one. You mentioned concurrency models earlier, so I have this question: where can I find the best practices to apply the concurrency model into KMP?
Well, I would say the last few years of my life have been trying to convince people that's not terrible. So, if you look at a recent
Touchlab blog.
Well, I haven't written a blog post ever.
I think it was someone on your team, though. Yeah.
Oh no! Yeah, I've traded my visibility for kind of everyone else is doing stuff, which is neat. And then I'm like, man, I got to write a blog post. And then 2 months later, I'm like, man, I got to write a blog post. But I was trying to explain the concurrency model, because people, I'm like, adoption's not going to happen unless people understand it. But then Jeff Rains was like, well, adoption's not going to happen until we change it. So, like, we're in this weird flux state. But on the documentation website, there's a hands-on. I wrote the hands-on. Of course, I'm going to recommend that because it has all of the thoughts I have. And then I have some blog posts which are kind of old now. It's going on, I guess, 2019, early 2020. And then a talk I gave at Kotlin. Not to give all my own resources, but I swear, like, nobody else really tried to explain the model. So I only know of my resources. Of course, I haven't had to look for it. I don't know if Josh, do you have any other?
Yeah. So basically, there's a blog post that you had done, and then I can't remember any specifics. I will just say that having learned the concurrency model, it's not that bad. Like, it's intimidating at first, and then just seeing those error logs of, like frozen exception, whatever, is annoying at first, but then you figure it out. Uh, and something that I found helpful was that knowing the coroutines machinery is like sort of like uh, it's safe to freeze. And so some of the ways that we've gotten around it at Volley is by using things like completable deferreds, like, because you can freeze that and still, like, after it's frozen, like, it uses atomic variables under the hood. So, like, after it's frozen, you could still, like, call complete and pass a value to it. So that's been really great for us. And then just another way we've gotten around it is doing our multi-threading in Swift, and then just freeze, like, because usually we're freezing a data class, a Kotlin data class. So, like, you just need to freeze the Kotlin data class, and that's been okay. I see Kevin smiling, and I'm curious, like, if he has any thoughts on it.
No, I just think it's funny because it's like, well, just do it in Swift and wait for the exception. If you don't get one, then your thumbs up. You know what I mean? No, I had this weird, so I have this weird thought of, like, a year or two from now, whenever this concurrency model is gone, I feel like anyone that had forced themselves to really learn it, it was like a really long and painful way to really get good at concurrency. In the sense that, like, my advice is generally, especially now that we've had to learn this concurrency model, you should be very intentional about what thread you're in. And I think people kind of have one or two approaches, which is, like, especially, coming out of, let's say, a CS degree going back decades now, and you start with the web, and the web never has to deal with multiple threads, basically, unless you do some really crazy server stuff, right? So you never really deal with any of these things. And then the hardest thing I used to tell people getting into Android was, like, understanding threading and dealing with it. But you don't really understand the problems because you essentially don't get an exception with race conditions. And the idea behind the concurrency model of Kotlin Native is that it's not going to let you do things that you shouldn't be doing. So it forces you to learn a lot. So I would say, my best practice is essentially understand, which parts of your code are going to remain unfrozen, and understand that the rest will be frozen. And we generally do, like, view models. That kind of layer is all main thread. Nothing in there is touched by another thread. And ensure never frozen is your friend. We put that in the init for the view models. That way, if you inadvertently capture state, which is 99% of the time how you're doing unintentional freezing, it won't let you do that. And then once you get into that model, as long as you're not doing any crazy performance things, if you're just building apps, like, once you get used to it, you really don't run into that many problems. But, this is all useful knowledge that you get really good at, and then all of a sudden it's going to be gone. and then you can do whatever you want. But it is interesting. We had somebody apply recently, and an applicant, and then it's like an Android developer. Because nobody really has deep KMM experience. Some people do. Almost everybody not yet. And it's just really interesting to see someone that's clearly, like, super experienced with Kotlin, senior engineer, and then, like, I'm looking at their code, and they have global objects with vars in them, and I can see that they're changing that value from different threads. And I just want to be like, you don't even know that's a problem, and you'll never know, but it is a problem. and I know that now because I've been forced to to understand that. So.
Yeah. Okay. So we got some questions here. Before we get to them, you brought something up. You mentioned something called Never Frozen. Is that like a library?
No, it's a primitive on native. It's a function that's defined on every object, and it's called ensure never frozen. And what that does is, so the problem is when something freezing happens silently, and you'll get an exception when you then try to change what's frozen. And that's, people complain about that a lot. They're like, this should be compile time. It sucks. I'm like, okay, a lot of stuff happens at runtime in the Android world too. Like, you know, actually very similar thing. You're not allowed to change the UI from a background thread, and it'll tell you that at runtime with an exception, and for the same reasons. That's why I don't understand why people are so like worked up about this. Like, it's the same principle. It's thread confinement. Now, problem is, in a very simple example, it's easy to figure out what's going on. In a normal large app, it can be very difficult to trace, like, when did that get frozen? Like, that's the problem. Like, it's frozen now, you get an exception, but you don't know why it's frozen. So if you call ensure never frozen on any object, if then the freeze attempt happens on it, the operation will fail and it'll throw an exception. You know exactly what tried to do it. And it's usually just, you have some piece of state in a Lambda that you didn't need to have in there. It's almost always what the issue is.
That's what's happened when I've seen it.
Yeah, I mean, there's no other, you know, it's not like you call freeze on something that you didn't intend to. That never happens. Like, it gets captured into a thing. I actually wrote, back when I was trying to convince people that this was okay, before JetBrains announced they were changing it, like, I was working on an IntelliJ plugin that would warn you. It would essentially say, like, this thing is going to get trapped by this other Lambda, and it's probably going to get frozen. Make sure that that's okay. You know? But that never saw the light of day because it was about half done, conservatively speaking, and or liberally speaking, probably half. It was probably less than half done, and then they announced they were changing the model. So, like, all my endless concurrency work kind of took a back burner. So.
No. Sorry, I think we froze a second.
Yeah, what's up? Oh, okay.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know. So this is an interesting topic. I have a question here from Tyler Wilson, though. He's asking about, he says, I mentioned it, but then clarified that it was Josh. Injecting Swift into a KMM module. He wants to know more about it. So.
Yeah, so with the expect actual class, it's basically an interface. You write the expect in the common module, and then like the actual class in the iOS or the Android module for the all within the shared module. And then so for the actual class on iOS, what we did was we had to take a delegate in the constructor, and then all the functions fields were backed by the delegate. And then when it came to instantiating it, we had like we used a factory to instantiate it, but like we pass it to the common layer through dependency injection. I mean, you don't need to use dependency injection, but it made our lives easier. But yeah, like, so we just, like, for the actual class, we passed we use a factory to create a delegate provided by the actual app.
Gotcha.
So we do a lot of that. Like, actually, we kind of walked away a lot from expect actual, which I feel like everyone sees that, and it's like, oh great, that's the new thing. We should use that everywhere. And then 6 months later, you spend a lot of time yanking it out, but in favor of interfaces. Because interfaces do the same kind of thing, but they're far more flexible because you can have a different implementation for testing. Right? Like, so we do the same thing. Like, I wish the Droid app was running. I spent, it's like this damn CocoaPods thing. I don't know what it is about iOS packaging, but it's killing me. But for analytics on the Droid app, like, you know, if we're using Crashlytics, you have two options. You can either get C interop to ingest the entire, whatever, what do we call it? Firebase. The entire,
framework?
Fire. Well, you can ingest that entire header and do all this
The bill of
crazy stuff.
materials.
And like you can have this function call just for analytics, or almost all analytics implementations are like a string and then a map of strings to strings, because it's just like loose data. So we just pass in to our shared code. We have essentially an analytics interface. It just takes a log event, and it just takes a map with a string name for the event. And then on initialization of the app on the Swift side, we just, it's like any other protocol to Swift. So you can just implement it with Swift. We pass that in. We do that for a bunch of different things. It allows you to inject Swift into the thing. The downside, of course, is if you are running tests in your shared code, there's no place to inject Swift during the Gradle testing phase. So you have to have like another implementation that's fully in Kotlin, or you have to do something complex, like run your tests from Xcode with XC test, and then call into the test runner in Kotlin and pass in the thing. Like that part, the testing situation is a whole other meetup also. It's complicated.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. So it feels like a lot of people are doing essentially the equivalent of just callbacks from KMM into Swift, and or delegates. Is that to change things that they're trying to redo it now with what do they call those things? They're so when you use a coroutine, a suspend function from Swift right now, they actually have a implementation that they provide to you where
it takes it takes a completion handler, like for success or error, I think.
That's where I was looking for, a completion handler. So here's the thing: the completion handler, I've heard on some of the sites, like it's a great idea, but it doesn't handle your cancellation problem. So what is the magic solution, and when are we going to get to it? I mean, what do we want to do to make it easier to work with?
So I have pretty strong feelings about that. We don't use the generated coroutines interface from Kotlin to Swift. They do that completion handler thing, but you're right. You can't control the life cycle. So it's an interesting debate. I don't know where it's going to land. I guess there are folks who are like, well, can we get that to be something where you can expose this thing to control the life cycle, yada yada. But the problem, I think, is Kotlin X coroutines is not part of the language. It's a library on top of the core language. So to expose something that can control the life cycle, it's kind of like you have to expose parts of a library, unless I really don't understand it that well. We currently, it sucks, but it's boilerplatey, but you have to write that interface. We just do that. Mm-hmm. There are a few attempts that are doing some compiler generated code to assist with this, and I think if we ever get a few weeks of like not too busy time, Russell wants to get back to that, because he wrote a blog post about going from Flow to like RX Swift and combine. But we, there's an amount of like ugliness of casting and stuff. It's not great. Like so I think that there's going to be some compiler assisted stuff, and we and I know there's a few things out there. I don't know them off the top of my head, but it's a library space that needs a lot of attention, and then it's also going to be interestingly more complicated as thoughts around architecture change with Compose, and to some degree with UI. So it's a TBD answer. I could have summed that up, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, for us, we generally don't call suspend functions from the Swift side. Like that's all in the shared code as well. When we're reacting asynchronously to anything, it's with flows, which we have like a wrapper for it to consume it on the Swift side, which I think the JetBrains recent sample app had the same thing, like Cflow or something. So that that for us has been working very well. And then, yeah, I'm curious about Russell's blog post, because I've been thinking about converting them to Compose as well, because we're not using Swift UI yet, but we'd like to. And so just easy conversion would be great, because in the JetBrains sample app I just mentioned, I saw that they were just converting everything manually.
Well, there's multiple parts to it, and this is another thing that Russell um, worked up internally. And like, so we have a bunch of code internally that we're like, all right, let's use it on our internal silly sample things, and then like, okay, let's try using this for the client's like legit real app, and then eventually it might wind up, making it to the surface of public. There's multiple issues. One of them is you need something that models the life cycle in a consistent way. So like all of the, on the Android side, like essentially our shared code stops at an interface that is coroutines aware. Like we'll expose flows, we'll expose suspend functions, and then the Android side can essentially call into this, and Android is managing the coroutines lifecycle in the context of Android's lifecycle in a way that will allow the Jetpack team to do, because they're really good at that, right? Like I don't want to get anywhere near that. But on the iOS side, we essentially write a layer that makes a callback interface that you can call, and does things like that. But that layer has to manage the lifecycle. That's like one problem, right? Like we've had an issue where, somebody in one of the apps, like somebody added a call to like shut down the coroutine scope when the view controller went away. And that works great until the view controller comes back and it's no longer getting data. So it was like, you got to be really precise, and that's like one problem. But then, going over the wall and like passing these things and translating them into ArcSwift or Combine, it's kind of a different thing. And that's where Russell's, he's been doing kind of both of those layers, but then he just started a new client project. So he's super busy, so I can't pick his brain. I'm trying to like get that out of him.
Does async await change the picture at all? Is this gonna? Because it seems like, if I remember right, it's only like certain versions of iOS that only certain phones support that'll do async await.
I mean, Josh, do you have a coherent answer on this? Because I only have the answers I intend to research.
No, because when that news came out, I know people were really excited, but I was like, I mean, I kind of used Compose beforehand, so it wasn't as exciting to me. So I kind of ignored that news.
Yeah, well, what's interesting?
iOS 15.
iOS 15. It's Heath. It is funny when we do these things. I'm like, I usually recognize everybody. But anyway, yeah. I'm interested to read Kotlin Roman's take on it, because obviously, I mean, he's the coroutines architect, or I think he is. I hope I'm not offending anybody in St. Petersburg. Sorry, but it's because like coroutines is a much more I guess comprehensive implementation of these things. For async await in other languages, it's usually kind of very specific to this thing. But I'm concurrently, not to use that word in a different context, interested with how much iOS's features are tied to the version of the OS itself. So at a time when Compose and Flutter and like whatever are trying to decouple the UI from the operating system that it ships on top of, like Swift UI is directly coupled to the OS version we have. And I'm actually surprised that async await would also be coupled not just to the Swift version. I had no idea until this call that it was also tied to the iOS version, which to me is bananas. Like, why would you?
Yeah.
It seems, I don't know. Call me Call me surprised. I assume that even if they don't directly translate, though, once that becomes common, there'll be a there'll be a way to call suspend function by way of async await. But, I don't know. To be researched.
Okay, here we have another response from Heath here, saying why they needed to limit it to a certain OS version. It's because they do a lot of work sharing throughout the OS, and this is what does it for them, I guess. I don't know. That's the answer. Yeah.
I don't know. I'm hearing a lot of excuses from Apple. That's all I'm hearing.
What? Yeah, I do too.
Hot take. No.
Okay, so I'll take this question here that we had that's actually quite simple. So when using KMM, are you still tied to using the native Android concepts, APIs, XABs, and fragments? And so the answer is, if you're building an Android app, yes, you still need that because you're actually building an Android app. With KMM, it lives like most apps that are being made with KMM, that lives further down. So usually from the view model layer to down to your repository and down from there. So yes, you still have to use some Android native concepts and some iOS native concepts in your UI. Hopefully that changes and we can start to, we've got these Jetpack Compose, we've got Swift UI. They're really pushing together the way we do UI in a very big way. It would be great if we could write that once, but we're not there.
Well, I don't want to freak anybody out, but you'll look at the desktop compose thing from JetBrains. They do have it's slowly coming. It's public, so I guess I can just say whatever. They have a Mac OS compose native, very, very, very not very functional implementation going. And that's not super far from an iOS native. So it's, I don't know when, but eventually there will be Compose iOS. Now, would you want to use it? That's a whole different discussion. We've been doing, I wish I had screenshots. We've been doing experiments with Compose and then Foundation layout, but using that to drive UI kit components on iOS. But
interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I got really excited about it, and then it's hard to justify. Because when we think about doing stuff, we have to think about the resources that we're going to put into it. Resources being people and time, and I have to put business hat on, and it's how much work is it going to take to make this functional? And then once you finally get around to doing it, 6 months later, JetBrains or Google or somebody's going to be here's the full version, and then all that work is kind of thrown out the window. So I don't know, but I do think if DroidCon New York is supposed to happen in November, which we'll see how all these variants progress, and I'm soft committing that the iOS version is going to use Compose to drive UIKit for that, because if it goes wrong, no one gets fired. So there you go.
I find it interesting because in the early days of KMP, it seemed like one of the selling points was that it doesn't handle UI. It's it's baked into the philosophy that we're setting boundaries for what this can do, and that appealed to me a lot. And so now to have more more buzz around wait, no, but there will be
so
shared code for everything.
I feel like even the marketing team at Touchlab does not remember that I say this every time. It's not necessarily UI, and there's something to unpack there, which means you're not locked into an all-in-one situation. No offense to the Flutter fans, but it's really hard to do Flutter and everything else still now. Yes, you can do channels. Yes, it's possible, but it's not fluent. It's not easy. With Kotlin, it's easy to have just a bunch of crazy database logic using SQLite on iOS. But then you can also add some architecture logic, and you can also add a text calculator over here in another module. And then, God forbid, your settings screen is not interesting, and you just want to have a not interesting UI that's coded once, like maybe eventually that'll be possible too. Your main interactions will probably be entirely native.
Yeah.
The point is that you don't have to make a big decision to get locked into it. You can add that, see if it's something you want to do for some of your app, but you don't have to. And that's like, so my long tail thing is I'm not like in the back of my mind thinking like, man, when Compose gets here, it's off to the races. Like, I don't think I'm not waiting for that. Like, I don't think that's like a big thing that's really going to drive this. It's just another thing that would be nice to say, like, I won't say the company, this is going back before KMM. It was, back when we were just doing just native mobile. And they had this huge thing on the wall. It was all these screenshots. And some were iOS and some were Android. And some of them had like a different color border around them. And I was like, what is going on? And that's like, oh, that's our product people trying to figure out which features aren't properly supported on different platforms. I'm like, you have to do that forensically to go back? And they're like, yeah, that sucks. And these are screens that people probably see once or never. Like, they're deep in the weeds setting screens. And like, if you can just like homogenize that without also having to adopt an entirely different language or ecosystem, but then still have a native experience with other screens, that's a thing I think might be interesting to some people. We'll see how it goes.
Definitely. So I think we've like, it's nearing the end of our scheduled time. We've scared people sufficiently, I think, with the freezing and the issues with trying to talk across boundaries. But like, what are the good stories? What are the stories where like you've had people like turned around completely and saying how amazing it is? So what's a crazy situation that you've had like that?
So
You go first. I have to think. What if people have just been like, "Oh, thank God you're here"? Like, I don't know.
for us, it's working in a new technology and just figuring stuff out. Like, I remember just the first sample app where we shared network logic with Ktor. That was exciting. And then just being it's exciting to be an early adopter too, because it's like you feel like you're breaking ground here. And then especially if you're like in the community, like able to contribute back or anything, that feels great.
Sort of along those lines, I'll tell you that the Android Developer Conference reaction and interest level when talking about a Kotlin thing is wildly different than when I was trying to convince them that J2OBJC wasn't a terrible technology. I will say that it's been fun. No, but it's weird because I think it's kind of like it's like everything that's initially like kind of cool and interesting, and then you immediately forget about it. Like when you're working with a team who's like started adopting modules, there is a phase of like, wow, it's really kind of cool that you can do that in a shared code sense, and then people immediately, they get used to it. But it's like the fact that like you can go to an iOS focused team and say, if you don't like core data, we can do this, or what we're doing right now with a larger app. It's actually it's an SDK for a large set of apps inside of a very large org. And we're doing all of the analytics in a centralized place. And we're doing with them typed interfaces. And it's just like, you can't have a string have the wrong case. You can't have anything being wrong. It's all typed calls now. It's just like taking that out of a spreadsheet and turning it into code, and then being able to call from different platforms, and that it's not going to be screwed up, for lack of a better term. Because the developers, everyone hates writing analytics calls because they're like, there's no joy for a developer. It's like not a cool interface thing. You get nothing out of it. All the joy is from the marketing people. So it's really hard to get that right, and it's like, so being able to deliver that as a shared thing is, it's been interesting. I don't know. I would say a couple of things. I'm going to quote Jesse Wilson here. It's like, once you get people from the iOS side like interested. It's like you give them the superpower to be able to ship code back into the Android world if they're willing to like learn what's going on and figure it out, which is pretty cool. And then also it is like take the thing that nobody likes. I really haven't met many iOS developers who like core data and be like, hey, you can stop doing that. Like we have another way to do this. Is also something that's kind of cool. And then also analytics. Nobody likes analytics. Yada yada.
I'd also like to add that I mentioned this earlier, but the benefit for us is aligning the architectures. Just the payoff for that became immediately evident, just in terms of like it was much easier to think about everything, to keep all the mental models in your head, and that like I think that win is huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually started. We did a big mob session earlier this year, where we decided we were going to try building out this thing as a spike, just a research spike, to try a Kotlin multi-platform. And I was actually beating myself up because we spent more than an hour trying to get it that I could build the iOS app, run it without ever opening Xcode. But all I had to do was to crack open Xcode, start the emulator, and everything worked fine. And I was beating myself up because, like, at the end of the day, I'm like, we spent all this time watching people struggle, watching me struggle with little things like that, and then they're like, no, look at the goals for the day and what we were expecting to have done. We thought all we'd have at the end of the day was a little bit of text on the screen on both platforms running, and you actually had it pulling data off Apollo, off a GraphQL server, and putting it on both machines at the same time, or both apps on Android and iOS. So it feels like it's easy to talk about the pains and forget about the points that are really going well.
Well, I would 100% agree with that. Like one of the things, so again, it could be an entirely different Meetup roundtable discussion about how do you sell this to your other developer counterparts, right? And one of the things I would advise against if you're an Android, if you've noticed the whole time I try to say Android focused developer, not an Android developer, is you have to start working away from the identity of the platform a bit. Like you have to maybe be a mobile developer. But if the debate like kind of turns into KMP outputs this thing and then Swift does this, so that it's like, if it's like comparing to Swift, you're going to lose, right? Because it doesn't have the same generics, and Kotlin's a different language, and it has an Objective-C interface. And like it's just, you're not, there's no structs, there's no enums with associated values. That straight comparison is going to lose, but that argument misses, like, it's like the forest for the trees. It's like, yeah, it's not Swift, but it also like allows you to ship code on both platforms in a way that's like very usable, and like it's like missing that main point, like that's like sort of magical in its own context. You have to keep that in mind. And I would say also along with that, like a sense of compromise, because if there's no compromise, like it's never going to work. It is certainly not perfect, but it does some cool stuff until it doesn't. Like when I can't get CocoaPods to work, and then you're hating life. Cool. Which is currently where I'm at. As soon as the call is over, I gotta go figure this out.
Well, we're going to try to do Swift Package Manager. I don't know if I'm getting myself into too much pain, but hey, it was great having you guys on.
Wow, I mean, that's a whole different. I had like 2-3 weeks straight of trying to figure out how Carthage could work in this context. It's just like, man, I don't know what it is. As much as we complain about Gradle in the Android-focused world or whatever, like, it's a hellscape over at iOS. No offense, earmuffs, iOS fans. It's terrible.
I've dealt with some CocoaPod issues, and I've just decided, like, okay, I'm not going to try and import CocoaPods into the shared module. Like, that's just going to take that off my plate.
What I'm doing right now is I've quite literally created an entirely brand new iOS project, and I'm copying all of the DroidCon app iOS specific stuff into it and just recreate the project from scratch, because I cannot figure out for the life of me what the hell is going on. And I just take increasingly drastic. This is like, you know, threat level 3, where you're like, all right, make a new project, and the next one is like reinstall the OS, get a new laptop, you know, quit, find a new career. I mean, these are like levels of escalation. But you know, I'm currently at the just make a new project and start over.
You laugh, but in the days of Eclipse, there was actually I was doing a hackathon, and that the only way I could actually get this thing to rebuild my changes adopted into the code was to actually uninstall Eclipse and reinstall it. So it's like, yeah, you're almost down to the level of, you know, like, just start a new career, start over.
Oh, I've had that. I mean, like, I feel like it was more back in the Windows days, but you had that, like, okay, just reinstall Windows, and then maybe that'll fix the problem. Heath is talking about. I actually like OpenPods. I just have no idea what what the heck is going wrong with the particular project. Drive me crazy. But I have low tolerance for the project, especially in a non-commercial project. I'm just gonna start over. Whatever.
It's been great having all you guys on. Next month, I have Steve Peterson, who's going to talk Jetpack Compose. So thanks so much for coming.
Thanks so much for having us. It was great being here.
I'll send you our horrible UI kit on iOS Compose screenshots, and then we can see how that works out. Yeah, thanks for having us.
So much. See you guys.